Welcome, Meg. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss sorrow and bliss.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.
Ah. Would you mind telling listeners what your novel is about?
Sure, I'm getting better at this. It's so difficult to tell someone in such a short, I'm like, I can kind of do an elevator pitch as long as the elevator is stalled. That's kind of where I'm up to. It has to be a stuck elevator. To me, it's a love story about Martha and Patrick. It's the love story kind of told from the very beginning of their relationship when they're teenagers, when they first meet each other, all the way to Martha's early 40s when the book opens and things seem to be on their last legs in terms of their relationship. Within that, it pivots on mental illness is a strong theme that runs through it. That is why we've arrived at the point where they both seem to be at their end. And then I think as well through exploring that it's a coming of age because a delayed coming of age because Martha at 40 kind of has to make these decisions that finally force her to grow up in a way that I think a lot of us experience. I think, the idea that a coming of age occurs when you're a teenager, just about to enter college, 18, you drive across country. That didn't do it for me. Do you know what I mean? That's not when I grew up. It was much later than that after life had had its kind of way with me. Do you know what I mean? Like marriage and children and all of those things. That's what forces you to kind of be like, oh, no one's coming to save me. No one's coming to rescue me. And you're faced with these decisions of how do I proceed? And I think that's where we meet Martha. So it's those three things tied together.
Wow. So, and where did this book come from? Where did the idea come from? And by the way, I love that you have a whole passage in here when Martha is thinking about writing and is annoyed that people always think that her autobiographical work is autobiographical. And I'm like, well, I can't ask her now if it's autobiographical because in
Oh,
this
that's
book,
so
even
good.
her character says it's not autobiographical.
It served its purpose. No, it's fine. I think there are some little jokes through there that are just, I guess I snuck them in. This is my third book, and I guess I kind of, the extent to which Martha is, there are parts of her that, of course, are based on things I've experienced. And I think all authors have a really tricky relationship with that question because I always feel like if anyone wants to ask me anything, then I'm lucky because, they could also equally well not be interested and ignore the book completely. And so, I think it's an interesting question. I've asked it of authors myself as a journalist, but it's so hard because we're so, it's that mixture, it's imagination. I'm answering it for you right now, even
Great.
though you didn't ask it. It's partly imagination, it's partly, things that you've seen or witnessed. And especially for me, this kind of ties into where the book came from. But this was my Hail Mary pass of a novel. This was going to be the last one. It wasn't even going to exist. And so anything that I'd felt, heard, seen, it all went in there within these characters. But then as well, I think authors are so insecure and so prideful. It's a funny combination, which I think Anne Lamott has kind of talked about, that we have these enormous egos and yet we're so insecure that when someone assumes that it must just be you with the names changed, you feel like you don't think I'm capable of doing anything other than, the thinly veiled thing. So, that's why it sits, uneasily. And that's why I snuck a little reference into that, I guess, anticipating the question slightly. But no, I'm very happy to answer it. Where the book came from is I guess like the ash heap of my career would probably be the most realistic way to describe it. It's just, yeah, the potted summary is that I'd spent all of 2018 on a novel that I got to the end and I knew it had been wrong since maybe February, and I couldn't just give up. And then the more words you acquire, that you build, then you can't give it up once it's 40,000. And then, at 60,000, you're like, oh, I wish I'd just got rid of it at 40. You know what I mean? But it keeps going and it keeps going. And as a writer, especially if it's your first book, it's hard. It's not, there will be bad days, but there was only bad days. And that showed so clearly on the page. And I arrived at the end. It was sort of due in a week. I think it was, 85,000 words by then, and it was just bad. It was just, and it wasn't me being like, oh, it's terrible and I want my publisher to tell me it's great. It was, I didn't even want her to read it, which is what the note said that I attached to it. And then, yeah, it was just that I was showing it to her to be like, I tried, and so I'm quitting having tried, and how do I give you an advance back, especially an advance that I had spent many months ago. And that was going to be tricky. So she was amazing. I don't know how publishers do it because, to mop up the emotion and to just sort of tell you it's going to be all right and to not put any pressure on me to be like, well, go away and redraft it, start over and do it again. She just let me go. And I just I, it sounds so dramatic and ridiculous, but I did have this grieving period because this is what I wanted to do with my life. I remember writing my first novel when I was 8, and it's still somewhere in a shoebox on my granny's word processor. She must have loved it because I went into her little study for hours and hours and hours to, work on my work on my craft. And anyway, so then of course, a few weeks pass, and the idea that became that first section in the book at Martha and Patrick at a wedding, it just came, those little scenes and pictures just drop into your mind. I don't know where. And I wrote it down, and then somehow it just opened some sort of floodgates, I think. But again, it was months until I had showed anyone, told my publisher, even considered it as a novel. But because that's where I think that tone comes from, and that kind of very compared to what I've done before, the tone is quite straight. There's no novelizing in there. There's no me trying to perform to an audience. It's just, I just let Martha tell this story of hers as though she was speaking to you. So, if I was chatting to you, I wouldn't be ramming my sentences full of adverbs and, exciting adjectives instead of just walking and sitting and eating, which is what, that's the sort of language she uses. So I think, but I'm so glad that that was the upshot of that work style, because I think that the danger with a book about mental illness is that it would be overwhelming if I was trying to perform with the writing as well. This material can be really heavy, and it's quite emotional in and of itself, of course. So if I was trying to amp that up instead of tone that down with this funny prosaic language, I think people would have been like, oh, gee, you do know what I mean? By kind of chapter 2, it's too hard. I think I need some Nora Ephron. So it's somehow that's how it evolved. And here we are, I guess.
Wow. Well, that was a really interesting answer. Thank you for that. Wow. Well, I think that this type of writing deserves just as much credit. I mean, this was like you get immersed immediately into Martha's consciousness, and you go through it all with her. And just because the words aren't SAT words or aren't multisyllabic in every single chance doesn't mean it's not as effective. I mean, I think that's your point as well. But I don't know. I wasn't sitting here reading it thinking like, oh, this is so unliterary.
This is so basic. She's so basic.
It doesn't feel basic at all. In fact, it feels like you're so witty. Like, I love that sort of like British wit. I don't know how you all like somehow it's like so much funnier than anybody in America, the way your sense of humor. I'm just going to group it as an entire nation or something. But
oh, do it. Absolutely. I'm so happy to be class because I'm actually, well, I'm a New Zealand born writer, but I live in Australia. So I guess I have somehow from being in London for a few years.
Not British then.
Commonwealth, I guess. Commonwealth.
Commonwealth humor. I'm sorry. I didn't.
No, that's fine. No, it's British humor, but somehow I've absorbed it. I think that's what the stuff that you watch or read as you're, a teenager. And that was what I completely lived on. So all of that sort of thing, French and Saunders and all of that. But I was nervous about it coming out in the US because it's portrayed as it's portrayed as a funny story. Like that's kind of in all the materials. But I'm like, not laugh out loud. Do you know what I mean? Like, can we just tell everybody there's no jokes in there. Do you know what I mean? There's no callbacks and build-ups and all of that sort of thing. It's just those little observations and absurdities. And I always think of it as it's the British Office compared to the US Office TV show. So if you didn't like the British Office and it was too dark, maybe, you know what I mean? It's going to be more of a struggle. But if that's your flavor, then I'm glad that people enjoy it that way.
Even like your really subtle scenes, like when Patrick asks Martha if he's like, do you like old movies? And she's like, no one does. And he's like, okay, want to go at 7:30? And she's like, of course.
Yeah. And he's like, do you want to?
So simple, but you had like, no, he said, she said. It's just like perfect. I don't know. It's just funny.
Oh, thank you. And it helped as well to kind of have that personality of hers to fall back on when there are scenes like she finally acquires this diagnosis after 20 years of searching, or 15, because the last 5 she gave up and decided it was just her awful personality and that she's a terrible person, and that was what was informing all her decisions. But she reaches this moment where the psychiatrist who she's sort of finally found makes this pronouncement, and I was glad to have her ability to kind of reduce that moment right down to a joke rather than her having to express that, oh my goodness, the mystery of my existence has been solved, because we don't talk like that. We would never say that in the context of a doctor's office. We would say what she says, which is, oh, well, if it's that, I hope it's the 24-hour kind, because you diffuse that emotion that's too extreme a lot of the time. And so I was glad to have that function to rely on. And then, of course, there's her sister who takes it a level further in terms of the darkness and the humor and that sort of thing. So they were a good pair to be able to explore and fall back on.
And tell me what part of the mental illness piece attracted you to writing about it. There were so many scenes, like even when she's flushing the pills down the toilet, for instance, or when she's first with Jonathan, or the moment where she's back in the house and she finds like an old discarded expired prescription for whatever, and she's like, I'm just going to take this and see what happens.
Yeah.
All her time on the couch, and just, oh my gosh, you just like wanted to, I felt like I wanted to hug her so many times, and like, kind of
Oh, that's good.
got her mom
Yeah.
across the face, like, get
Yeah,
out of the way, let
yeah.
me
Oh,
take care of her.
yes, she's tricky. Celia, her mother's tricky. I think it is because I had read somewhere a long time ago that women will face a much longer journey to get a diagnosis than men, with particular conditions that I researched into when I thought I might use one real condition in there and not the kind of amalgam, the unnamed amalgam that I eventually went with for all sorts of reasons. I had read that, in some cases, not with anxiety and depression, but with the more complex, the schizophrenias or bipolars, usually it will take a man, say on average 5 years or something, to find a diagnosis. A woman will be looking at upwards of a decade, because there's that residual, I guess, discrimination or imbalance in the medical system, where she's hysterical, she's hormonal, she's premenstrual, she needs a baby, whatever it is. We don't, I think, and still to this day, to a degree, necessarily get the same acknowledgement of being aware that something is wrong, because men don't really go to the doctor unless they're, sort of on death's door. So if they come in, they must be serious. But if we come in, we had a free morning and decided to, go chat to a doctor about some tiny invented condition. So I think I wanted to explore the difficulty of her actually, not so much what the condition was like, but what it was like to try and find that, and to be misdirected and to be dosed up with things that didn't work, and she knew it was making her worse or doing nothing, and the trial and error in that, because that's exhausting, if for people who I think have been through that, or people with any kind of chronic pain, migraine or whatever it is, to try and find someone who will listen to you and not patronize you. The very first doctor you see her going to when she's just experienced this kind of mental collapse at 17, which she describes as the little bomb going off in her brain, he sort of, it's like, it's so obviously glandular, well, what we call glandular fever. I think that's mono in your country. It's so obviously mono. I'm not even going to test for it. And there's no medication I can give you, but you know what teenage girls are like. They love a tablet. So here's an iron tablet. I'll give you something to swallow, kind of thing. And so she leaves feeling mad from that first moment, or minimized. And so I think that was the part of mental health that interests me, rather than the ins and outs of necessarily what it feels like from the inside, which I'm maybe not so qualified, or didn't feel so qualified to present as fact.
That's funny you say that, because in the book, I don't think you changed it to mono. So I was like, what? Because then you said, to her father, like, oh, she's been kissing too many boys. And he's like, have you been kissing boys or something like that? And she was like, no. And I was like, why would she be kissing boys? Anyway, now I understand.
Oh,
I get it.
glandular fever is
Glandular
apparently
fever.
transmitted that way. It
No,
was always
mono
the
is
thing.
transmitted
Yeah.
that way.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Oh, good.
No, I just missed that reference.
Yeah, no,
Oh,
fair
well.
enough.
And another element that I thought was so sort of poignant throughout the book is her relationship to this sort of unborn child along the way, right? This fetus that she always refers to. And even
Yeah.
the moment when she's on the double-decker bus with her head to the window, and she sees like a mom with a book propped up on her belly, which I feel like I could do these days even without a baby in my belly, and and like another mom comes over and they're chit-chatting, and she's like, okay, right then, I'm not gonna have kids, and then of course things change and change again,
Yeah.
and all this stuff. So tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about her ambivalence, I guess, and fear. I feel like a lot of it was fear.
Yeah, well, she is instructed by sort of, I guess it's Doctor Number Two, who prescribes her something, and this is still in her very late teens, and says, if you take this, you need to be really careful not to get pregnant, because this is unsafe for a fetus. And I think in the way that, as we get older, especially at my age now, I've learned that doctors I mean, bless them for all that they do and all of their hard work and sacrifice for us and care for us. But there are doctors who, I guess, make these pronouncements as if there's truth. And I think when you're Martha's age or teen, you just accept them. You don't question. That's a doctor. They know. The certificates are all over their wall, and so I will just take that, advice or that diagnosis wholesale. When you get older, especially I guess if you've had children and there's that massive opinion and conflicting opinion, and like, actually, I know, I instinctively know, and I will go and find a doctor who will listen until, that's kind of acknowledged. But she takes it as truth that these pills are dangerous. And even though she will come off those, there's something about that message that she absorbs, that the pills are dangerous, but the extension of that is that she is dangerous. And she has this condition that she doesn't understand, but develops this sense within herself and then stokes it and expands it that she would be dangerous as a mother and that she would be unsafe to a child. And so this is whether or not she even wanted children at that age, which we're far too young to kind of imagine ahead that much. She goes into marriage and into that age with that pre-knowledge, and so that informs all her decisions, and she decides that it isn't safe. And she has a brief kind of flirtation with the idea when she, in that disastrous first marriage to Jonathan, who's this very charismatic, you know, art dealer who creates this sense of her being amazing, and he's the first woman to kind of, and they're so wrong for each other. You can sort of see it from the disastrous public proposal, which doesn't suit her at all, to their very quick marriage and very short engagement. And he sort of tells her, it'd be amazing, let's do it. And she briefly wants to believe that maybe she's the person that Jonathan thinks she is. And so she goes off her medication, instantly crashes, and then it sort of proves to her, I can't live without this medication. It's true, I never should be a mother. And so, but I think the function of that for her, and she's obviously someone who isolates herself and puts herself outside regular, I guess, female experience. She doesn't have a lot of female friends because as she gets older, they all have children. And you know what it's like, it's hard to keep finding that common ground, whether you're the mum with who can only talk about your kids and you've got this single gorgeous friend who blows in and tells you about the big night she had before, the night before. And it's hard to find that commonality, but it pushes Martha outside the female experience. And so she ends up feeling disconnected from other women who've done that and become mothers. And then, of course, it challenges her relationship with Ingrid, who is crazy fertile and is just busting out these babies every kind of 18 months. So that's, I guess that's her relationship. But then there's a twist in it where we find out what her relationship has really been like to motherhood.
Wow. So you mentioned at the beginning, so now I have to go back to this, that your coming of age was more at age 40 with kids and everything else. So
yeah,
what was the turning point for you? Did something happen, or was it just growing up? Or tell me if there was a moment.
yeah, no, definitely. Well, I mean, really the opposite to Martha. I got married when I was 22. So at this point, I've nearly been married for more than half my life. And I had my first daughter when I was 25. So I almost have no experience of being an adult without also being a mother. But so I guess it's almost a case of, if you don't have that extra decade, I guess, to explore who you are and do all of those things and focus on yourself because you're focusing on this little baby instead. And then her sister who came along, 2.5 years later, you just get absorbed into that. And you do, I think, would it be safe to say that we all lose a little bit of identity, or we all kind of have our essential selves slightly broken down by that experience and we have to rebuild ourselves? So it wasn't until they were teenagers where I sort of emerged from that tunnel and went, oh, like I never did that growing up thing. So I guess I better do it now because, it's not like you don't develop maturity as a mother, but I think as a person, I was stopped at 25. That's where my exploration of my own character had taken its temporary 15-year pause. And so I kind of had to look at myself and be like, am I still acting in ways that I was at 25, especially in my marriage, I think, because how that, and this is what I put into Martha and Patrick, but how that dysfunction, whatever your dysfunction is in your relationship, that got built in very early. Like that was probably already there before there was even a ring on your finger. And so if you don't address that, it becomes so embedded and you find that 15, 20 years later, you're still acting out of that one place or that one disappointment that never was resolved. And so I think there was a lot of that that was waiting for me on the other side of children. So then it was like, okay, I'm going to take a pretty cold look at, who I am and weed out some stuff that should have been weeded out a long time ago. So I think it was that slow development of like, and feeling when I hit 40 that like, oh, I am a bit more of a grown up than I was. And I do actually know stuff about, how things work and that sort of stuff.
This reminds me of the scene when she goes to breakfast, well, kind of breakfast, but she's still in the bridesmaid's dress and everything with Patrick, and he's taking forever to order, and she was so happy because she didn't. I loved how you said how she's tired of people letting her go. I'll let you go. I'll let you go. She's like, no, I want somebody to have me stay. I want him to stay.
Yeah,
And
exactly,
so,
exactly.
and she's like, I loved that he took his time ordering, and she's like, later on at their like anniversary, you said how she like grabbed the menu from him and was like,
And
oh,
she's like,
you'll
just
have the
choose
steak.
something.
Yeah, just you'll have the steak.
Exactly. It had evolved into that thing of like, I can't bear that thing anymore. That thing was so charming at the beginning. And now if you do that one more time, you know what I mean? It's over between a divorce face kind of look happening. So yeah, I think, but that's what I loved exploring about that long arc, you know what I mean, of a relationship, because there are, of course, those intensely romantic proposal moments or whatever moment they're the highlights, but there's a lot of low lights, or at least mid-lights. You know what I mean? In a long relationship where it's like you're together and you're at home and you're cooking dinner, and where's the romance in that? You have to try pretty hard to find it. But sometimes those greatest moments of connection are on the sofa or on a walk. And I think that was fun to explore them, and in between the start when you meet them and the end, what happened in the middle is the interesting part to me.
So, Meg, what are you working on next? Do you have another novel in the
I
works?
do, I'm in that phase where I'm like, oh goodness. And it's exciting. It's really exciting because I realize it's the only way to leave these characters behind is to go and find a new set of characters, because Martha and Patrick and their whole world has been my world for 2 years. And it's a real challenge to let them go and belong to other people. And which is, I'm so happy to do it, but it's hard to break that connection because they do feel real, even though when authors say that, I used to just think, oh my gosh, they've lost their minds, that you made them up and now they're talking to you. Do you know what I mean? But it actually happens. And so that's what I'm most enjoying at the moment is to find out who this next set of people are. Well, getting to feel nostalgic about the last crew. But yeah, so I'm working away, and I'm writing for screen as well and doing bits and pieces like that. So it's busy, but for me, it's about creating that belief again that no one's ever going to see it, because that was so key to my experience that I have to try and convince myself somehow, which is getting harder and harder because of people like you, like getting the book out there, which I'm so grateful for. But I'm like, I have to pretend that I'm completely anonymous again. So I'll see how it goes.
I started writing something the other day, and I felt so panicked that people were going to see it that I eventually at the top of my document typed draft 1 of 3.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Just so that I was like, I'll write 2 more. No one's going to see this one.
That is such a good idea. And isn't it funny, because George Saunders describes that. I mean, he's just my absolute icon in every single way. He describes it as having to self-game, that you have to trick yourself into doing this thing, because I guess, it's difficult work, but I think the tricky thing about it, I imagine if you're a surgeon, you turn up to your laparoscopic appendectomy knowing how you're going to do it. You know what I mean? You've done it 50 times before. You do it exactly that way again. That'll be a perfect job. You don't have to worry that maybe this time you've forgotten. Maybe your talent for appendectomies has left you. Do you know what I mean? There's nothing left in the tank. But with writers, we sit down, we're having to recreate from nothing again and again every single day, and to face up to that, what feels like those limitations and the edge of our talent that's not going to take us to the extent that we need to go. So my equivalent of draft 1 of 3 is I name all my documents like, you can do this, you've done it before, and you'll do it again, doc. You know what I mean? So every time I look up, there's this crazy, I mean, it's insane, a lot of madness goes down in this little shed that I work in. So but whatever gets you there, don't you think? You find your tricks. The longer
100%.
you work, you find what works for you.
Like
but I might try that.
That's what I write on notes to my daughter. Literally that. You've done it before and you can do it again. You've got this,
Yeah,
We just all need to
exactly.
like take the notes we leave for our kids or something.
Exactly.
Give
We
it
need to be our own cheerleaders. It's
to.
so true. It's so true.
um,
Even if it makes you feel crazy.
yes. Well, I already feel crazy, but yeah. Do you have any other advice? This was you already were sprinkling in bits and pieces, of course, but any advice to aspiring authors?
Oh, yes. No, I have definitely at this stage, I have definitely acquired a lot of tricks like that. I think it's about finding what works for you and then sticking to it and not waiting. Just if you can't write today, there's no way you're going to write tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? There's no perfect tomorrow coming where suddenly you'll sit down and there'll be this enormous flow of words. And you do hear lots of writers explain that it's a muscle, which is true, and that you build it up as you keep going. I think definitely if you set a word target for yourself, maybe 500, because it's not impossible to face 500 words a day, and if you do a great 500, have momentum in the next day. But if you're having a terrible day, still just 500, you know what I mean? Like it's not too intimidating. But I think that you need to do that 500 every day and turn up. And I know with anything I'm doing, I need to work on it 7 days a week, because if you fall out of it for 2 days, it is so hard to get back in, and you kind of then have to go and read over it to remember where you were up to, and that takes a week by the time you get to a certain limit. So even if you just look at it and correct some grammar or something just every day to turn up for the work, because it just saves you a lot of re-entry. I think it's re-entry is painful, and it's a lot of time spent doing that. So I think that's what I've learned. But yeah, just to find your own way and then stick to that.
Sounds like how I feel about the gym. It's like once I take a few days off, it's like impossible. But once I'm
Exactly. You feel
doing it
like you've
every day,
never
it's like
been.
just
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
day, you know?
Exactly. Otherwise, you're like, I've never been to the gym before. I
Yeah,
physically don't know how to do this. Like,
exactly. I
this
can't
is
even
too,
breathe. What's going on?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Anyway,
Exactly. We trick ourselves. We learn the tricks to get ourselves there.
yes. Well, thank you. Thank you, Meg. Thanks for talking about Sorrow and Bliss. I really loved it. I love the characters too, so I see why you're very attached. And maybe we can do some cameos in your next book, like the Jeffersons, and
Oh,
like like those
exactly.
old
Oh, yeah,
TV
that's a
shows
good
where like
idea.
they
They'll
pop
turn
in
up.
for coffee or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I'll write the story of the woman who had the canapé, and we'll see Martha from the other side, see if she was,
Exactly. That could be
did
a
the
fun
pine
exercise.
paper. Exactly. But
Trick
thank you
yourself.
so much.
Okay.
It's been lovely to chat to you, and I'm so grateful to anyone who's read the book or passed the book on to someone, or, posted about it, because there wouldn't exist without all of that. So I'm really grateful. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course. All right. Take care. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.